I need a new mommy, and you need a rich single daddy husband," Emma announced with the matter-of-fact confidence of a 6-year-old who had just solved the world's problems. Maya nearly choked on her own breath, staring at this precocious child in her designer pink dress and perfectly styled blonde curls. The little girl stood in the rain outside the upscale coffee shop, completely unbothered by the puddles soaking her expensive shoes. Her bright blue eyes sparkled with the kind of innocent mischief that could only come from a child who had never been told that some problems didn't have simple solutions. Maya pulled her worn jacket tighter around herself, still processing the surreal conversation that had just changed the trajectory of her evening. The cardboard sign beside her reading, "Anything helps, God bless," seemed suddenly inadequate for the magnitude of what this child was proposing. Emma Charlotte Wellington III. A deep authoritative voice cut through the rain as a distinguished man in an expensive charcoal suit appeared, slightly out of breath and clearly frantic. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the weather, and his brown eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that probably built empires. "I told you to stay right beside me while I moved the car." His relief at finding his daughter safe was palpable, but Maya could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. This had to be the rich single daddy husband Emma had mentioned so confidently. The man's gaze shifted to Maya, taking in her situation with a quick, assessing look that wasn't judgmental but was definitely calculating. Maya scrambled to her feet, mortified by the entire situation and desperately wishing she could disappear into the sidewalk. Emma grabbed her father's hand with one small fist and reached for Maya's arm with the other, as if she could physically bind them together through sheer determination. "Daddy, this is Maya. She's going to be my new mommy, and you're going to marry her so we can all be happy." The child's announcement hung in the air between them like a challenge to the universe itself. James Wellington, because this had to be him, looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been panic. Maya felt heat creep up her neck despite the cold rain, wanting to apologize for existing in this moment. The silence stretched uncomfortably as both adults tried to process the social landmine a 6-year-old had just detonated. Emma, meanwhile, beamed at them both as if she'd just announced the weather. "Emma, sweetheart, you can't just—" James began, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd had this type of conversation before. But his daughter interrupted with the determination of a tiny general commanding her troops. "But Daddy, look! Maya is very pretty and she's sad like you, and she needs help and we need help too." Emma gestured between them as if presenting irrefutable evidence in a court of law. "She was a teacher for little kids like me, so she already knows how to be a mommy, and you need someone to make you smile again." The child's logic was simultaneously heartbreaking and surprisingly sound, delivered with the kind of brutal honesty that only children could manage. Maya found herself caught between wanting to flee and being touched by this little girl's desire to fix the broken pieces of everyone's lives. James's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter, and Maya could see the love and concern warring with helplessness in his eyes. "I'm so sorry about this," James said to Maya, his voice gentle but clearly embarrassed by his daughter's matchmaking attempt. "She's been going through a phase since her mother passed away last year." The weight of grief in those few words hit Maya like a physical blow, and suddenly Emma's behavior made heartbreaking sense. Maya could see the exhaustion that went deeper than just being tired. The bone-deep weariness of a man trying to hold himself and his child together while navigating an impossible loss. "She's just trying to take care of both of us," Maya said softly, understanding more than he might expect about the desperate need to fix things that couldn't be fixed. James studied her more carefully then, and she could see him taking in not just her homeless situation, but something in her voice that suggested she knew about loss too. The rain continued to fall around them, creating an oddly intimate bubble of shared understanding. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" James asked gently, and Maya could see Emma nodding encouragingly behind him like a tiny cheerleader. The question was asked without judgment, with the kind of careful concern that suggested he genuinely cared about the answer. The shelters have been full for weeks, Maya admitted, hating the vulnerability in her voice, but appreciating that he'd asked about safety rather than just shelter. She'd learned the hard way, that the two weren't always the same thing on the streets. The rain was getting heavier, and she could see the concern growing in both father and daughter's faces as they realized she'd be spending another night exposed to the elements. Emma's small hand slipped into Maya's, warm and trusting in a way that made Maya's throat tight with unexpected emotion. "We have 17 bedrooms in our house," Emma announced helpfully, as if the solution was obviously simple. "And Mrs. Henderson makes the best chocolate chip cookies in the whole world. And we have a library with 1,000 books and a garden with roses." Her enthusiasm was infectious, painting a picture of comfort and warmth that seemed like a fairy tale from Maya's current perspective. "Emma," James said gently, but there was something thoughtful in his expression now, as if his daughter's suggestion wasn't as impossible as it should have been. He looked at Maya again with those intelligent brown eyes, and she could see him weighing something in his mind that went beyond simple charity. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, and the kind of decision that could change everything. Maya held her breath, not daring to hope but unable to look away. "What's your story, Maya?" James asked simply, and the way he phrased it made something in her chest loosen slightly. He didn't ask what had gone wrong or how she'd ended up here. Just what her story was, as if she was still a person worth knowing rather than just a problem to be solved. It felt like the first time in months that someone had seen her as fully human, complete with a past that mattered and a future that was still possible. The kindness in the question, delivered without condescension or pity, nearly brought tears to her eyes. Emma squeezed her hand encouragingly, as if sensing that this was an important moment that required support. Maya took a deep breath, surprised to find herself wanting to share her truth with these strangers, who had somehow made her feel seen. Maya found herself opening up in a way she hadn't expected, the words coming easier than they had in months. "I was a kindergarten teacher for 5 years at Lincoln Elementary. I loved those kids like they were my own," she began, and saw Emma's face light up with delight at this confirmation of her matchmaking instincts. "Lost my job when the district had budget cuts last spring, then couldn't make rent when unemployment ran out." She kept it simple but honest, not dwelling on the cascade of small disasters that had led her here. "I've been trying to find work, but it's hard when you don't have an address for applications or interview clothes, or even a way to shower regularly." James listened, without the usual mixture of pity and discomfort. She'd grown accustomed to his expression, thoughtful rather than judgmental. Maya appreciated that he didn't try to offer easy solutions or empty reassurances. "You taught little kids like me?" Emma asked excitedly, bouncing slightly on her toes despite the rain. "That means you already know all the best games and stories, and how to make lunch with the crusts cut off." The child's logic was flawless in its simplicity, and Maya couldn't help but smile, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "I do know quite a few good stories," Maya admitted, watching Emma's face absolutely glow with happiness. "And I always cut the crusts off sandwiches, because they're the least interesting part." This declaration seemed to cement something in Emma's mind, as if Maya had just passed the most important test imaginable. James watched this exchange with an expression Maya couldn't quite read, but she thought she saw something like hope flickering in his eyes. "Emma has been struggling since her mother died," James said quietly, his voice careful but honest. "She's incredibly bright, but she's been having trouble in school, acting out, having difficulty concentrating." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, the helplessness of a parent who would move mountains for his child, but didn't know which mountain to start with. "We've tried private tutors, child psychologists, 3 different schools. Nothing seems to help her process what happened." Maya could see the frustration and guilt warring in his expression, the way he blamed himself for not being able to fix his daughter's pain. Emma nodded solemnly, suddenly looking older than her 6 years. "I get in trouble because I miss my mommy, and the other kids don't understand why I'm sad sometimes," she explained with the matter-of-fact delivery that seemed to be her specialty. The rain was coming down harder now, and Maya could see James, making some kind of internal calculation as he looked between her and his daughter. "This is probably crazy," he said slowly, "but would you like to come have dinner with us tonight? Just to get out of this weather." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline Maya was afraid to grab in case it disappeared. "I can't just impose on," she began, but Emma clapped her hands together with pure joy. "Yes, please say yes. We can show you my room and all my books, and maybe you can tell me a bedtime story." The child's enthusiasm was overwhelming in the best possible way, infectious enough to make even the impossible seem reasonable. James smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face and gave Maya a glimpse of the man he must have been before. Grief had carved those lines around his eyes. "What do you say, Maya?" James asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested this invitation meant more than just charity. No strings attached, just a warm meal and a dry place to sleep tonight. Emma could use the company, and honestly, he paused, looking down at his daughter with obvious love, I could use the help figuring out how to make her smile like this more often. The admission was vulnerable in a way. That suggested he didn't make a habit of asking for help. And Maya felt something shift in her chest. Emma was practically vibrating with excitement, already planning their evening with the kind of detailed enthusiasm only children could muster. Maya found herself nodding before her practical mind could list all the reasons. This was a terrible idea. "Okay," she said softly, hardly believing the word had come out of her mouth. Emma's squeal of delight could probably be heard 3 blocks away, and she immediately began chattering about everything she wanted to show Maya. "This is the best day ever. We can have Mrs. Henderson's pot roast and you can see my dollhouse, and maybe tomorrow. And we can go shopping for pretty dresses." The little girl was practically bouncing as she took Maya's hand, swinging it enthusiastically as they walked toward a sleek, black car that probably cost more than Maya had made in her last year of teaching. James fell into step beside them, and Maya caught him watching her with an expression that was curious, thoughtful and maybe a little hopeful. "I'm James Wellington, by the way," he said with a slight smile, offering his hand in a formal introduction that felt surreal given the circumstances. "Thank you," Maya replied, shaking his hand and meaning it more than he could possibly understand. For what it's worth, I think Emma might be onto something. As James opened the car door for her with old-fashioned courtesy, Maya felt like she was stepping into someone else's life. The leather interior was warm and soft, a sharp contrast to the cardboard and concrete that had been her world for the past 3 months. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see her soggy cardboard sign on the sidewalk, already being claimed by the wind, a symbol of the life she was leaving behind, at least for tonight. Emma climbed in beside her, immediately launching into a detailed description of every room in their house and all the things they could do together. James caught Maya's eye in the rearview mirror as he started the engine, and she saw something like gratitude there that matched her own overwhelming sense of disbelief. "Daddy, isn't this perfect?" Emma announced with absolute certainty. "Now we can be a real family again." The Wellington mansion appeared through the rain like something out of a fairy tale, all elegant lines and glowing windows that spoke of warmth and safety. Maya tried not to gape as they pulled up the circular driveway, but it was impossible not to be impressed by the sheer scale of wealth she was witnessing. "It's really beautiful," she said quietly, and James seemed pleased by her genuine appreciation rather than intimidation. "My wife designed most of it," he said softly, and Maya could hear both love and loss in those few words. Emma was already unbuckling her seatbelt, ready to begin the grand tour she'd been planning since the coffee shop. "Mrs. Henderson is going to be so excited to meet you," the little girl declared, apparently confident that everyone would share her enthusiasm for this unexpected development. Maya took a deep breath, preparing to enter a world she'd never imagined being part of, led by a 6-year-old who seemed to believe that love and determination could solve any problem. Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a plump, cheerful woman in her 60s who barely batted an eye when Emma announced that Maya was going to be her new mommy. "Well, dear, you look like you could use a warm meal and dry clothes," she said practically, immediately bustling Maya toward the kitchen with the kind of maternal efficiency that suggested she'd been taking care of people her entire life. James followed, looking slightly dazed by how quickly his orderly life had been reorganized by his 6-year-old daughter. "Emma, let Maya catch her breath before you drag her all over the house," he said gently, but his daughter was having none of it. "But Daddy, she needs to see everything, so she knows it's going to be her home too." Emma's certainty was both touching and terrifying, especially when Maya caught James's expression of mixed hope and panic. The kitchen was warm and filled with the kind of smells that spoke of home and comfort, making Maya's empty stomach clench with longing. Over the most delicious meal Maya had eaten in months, she found herself drawn into easy conversation with this unlikely family. Emma chatted constantly, sharing every detail of her day and asking 1,000 questions about Maya's life as a teacher. "Did you have favorite students? Did you ever have to put anyone in time out? Do you know any songs about frogs?" The questions came rapid fire, and Maya found herself laughing more than she had in ages. James watched this interaction with obvious fascination, as if he was seeing his daughter come alive in a way she hadn't for months. "She hasn't talked this much since," he started to say, then stopped himself. "She really likes you," he finished instead. But Maya could fill in the blanks. Mrs. Henderson kept refilling Maya's plate and mug with the kind of aggressive hospitality that suggested she approved wholeheartedly of Emma's matchmaking scheme. After dinner, Emma insisted on the promised tour, dragging Maya from room to room with the enthusiasm of someone showing off treasures. The house was even more beautiful than Maya had imagined, filled with art and books and comfortable furniture that spoke of a family that had been genuinely happy. Emma's room was a little girl's dream, all pink and princess themes, with more toys than most children saw in a lifetime. "This was my mommy and daddy's room," Emma said more quietly when they reached the master suite, her voice taking on the careful tone children use when discussing painful topics. "Daddy sleeps there sometimes, but mostly he falls asleep in his office because he works too much." The insight was delivered with the kind of worried wisdom that no 6-year-old should possess, and Maya felt her heart break a little more for both of them. The guest room Emma chose for Maya was larger than the last 2 apartments she'd lived in, with a bathroom that included a soaking tub and more towels than one person could use in a month. "You can stay here forever and ever," Emma announced, as if the decision was already made and just needed to be implemented. "Emma," James said carefully from the doorway, "Maya might have other plans." But when he looked at Maya, there was a question in his eyes that went beyond just tonight's sleeping arrangements. "We should probably talk about logistics," he said quietly, and Maya nodded, understanding that the adult conversation about boundaries and expectations had been postponed long enough. Emma seemed to sense the shift in mood, her excitement dimming slightly as she realized the grown-ups might have concerns about her perfect plan. "How about you get ready for bed, sweetheart? And Maya and I will figure out the details," James suggested gently, and Emma's face immediately brightened again. "Can Maya read me a story, please? I have the best books, and she probably knows all the voices." The request was so hopeful that Maya found herself agreeing before James could intervene. "I'd love to," she said honestly, surprised by how much she meant it. It had been months since she'd felt useful, needed for something other than moving along or filling out forms. Emma clapped her hands and raced off to brush her teeth and put on pajamas, leaving the adults alone for the first time since the coffee shop. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they hadn't said and all the impossibilities Emma's plan would require. "I need to apologize," James said finally, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that suggested he was more rattled than he'd been letting on. "Emma has been fixated on the idea of finding me a new wife since her mother died, but she's never actually tried to recruit someone before." His smile was rueful, tinged with the exhaustion of single parenthood and fresh grief. "I think you handled it with more grace than most people would have managed." Maya appreciated the acknowledgement, but she could see there was more he wanted to say. "The thing is," he continued slowly, "I haven't seen her this animated, this genuinely happy in over a year, and I'm not sure how to handle that." The admission was vulnerable, the kind of truth that parents usually kept to themselves, because it felt like admitting failure. Maya chose her words carefully, understanding that what she said next could determine whether this fairy tale lasted longer than one night. She's a remarkable little girl, and she's been through something no child should have to experience, she said softly. But kids are resilient in ways adults aren't, and sometimes they see solutions we're too scared to consider. James studied her face, and Maya could see him weighing her words against his own fears and hopes. "You're not what I expected when I imagined having this conversation," he admitted with a slight smile. "Most people would have run screaming by now, or started talking about all the reasons Emma's plan was impossible." The fact that Maya hadn't done either seemed to intrigue him, and she could see him reassessing everything. He thought he knew about this situation. "I was a teacher for 5 years," Maya said simply. "I've learned that sometimes children understand things adults have forgotten, especially about what people need to be happy." She paused, looking around the beautiful house that felt more like a museum than a home. "Emma needs stability, and someone who sees her as more than a problem to be solved. You need—" She hesitated, not sure she had the right to voice what she saw in his exhausted eyes. "You need someone who understands that grief doesn't follow timelines and that loving someone new doesn't mean forgetting someone you've lost." The words hung between them. More honest than was probably wise, but Maya had spent too many months with nothing left to lose to start being careful now. James's expression shifted, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering across his features. "Emma!" James called up the stairs, his voice carefully controlled, but with an undercurrent of something that might have been excitement. "Are you ready for that story?" The thundering of small feet on hardwood announced Emma's enthusiastic response, and she appeared at the top of the stairs in princess pajamas, clutching an armful of books. "I picked 3 different ones so Maya can choose which one she wants to read," Emma announced, practically bouncing with anticipation. Maya felt something warm settle in her chest at being included in this bedtime ritual, at being trusted with this precious child who had somehow decided that a homeless stranger was exactly what her family needed. As they settled onto Emma's bed, surrounded by books and stuffed animals, Maya caught James watching from the doorway with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made her believe, just for a moment, that impossible things really could happen. The story Maya chose was about a little girl who went on adventures to help people, and Emma's running commentary made it clear she saw herself as the heroine. "That's just like what I did today," she whispered conspiratorially during a particularly relevant passage. "I found someone who needed help and brought them home." Maya couldn't argue with that logic, especially when Emma curled up against her side with the kind of trust that was both humbling and terrifying. James had settled into the chair by the window, and Maya could feel him watching, not just her interaction with Emma, but the way his daughter was responding, more relaxed and content than she'd probably been in months. When Emma's eyes finally started to flutter closed, she mumbled sleepily, "I knew you were perfect for us, Maya. Tomorrow we can start being a real family." The innocent certainty in those drowsy words made Maya's throat tight with emotion and possibility. After Emma was tucked in and fast asleep, Maya and James found themselves back in the kitchen with cups of coffee and the weight of adult reality settling around them. "So," James said finally, his voice careful but not unkind, "how do we handle this?" Maya appreciated that he'd phrased it as a shared problem, rather than just hers to solve. "I don't want to hurt her," Maya said honestly. "She's been through enough disappointment." James nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. "But I also can't pretend that staying here permanently is realistic, no matter how much we both might want to make her happy." The admission that she might want to stay slipped out before Maya could stop it, and she saw James's expression shift with what looked like relief. "The thing is," he said slowly, "I'm not sure it's as unrealistic as we think." "What do you mean?" Maya asked, her heart doing something complicated in her chest that felt dangerously like hope. James leaned forward, his business mind clearly working through possibilities. "Emma needs stability, and someone who understands children. You need security and a chance to rebuild your life." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "What if we could figure out an arrangement that worked for everyone?" Maya stared at him, wondering if she'd somehow fallen asleep and was dreaming this entire conversation. "You mean like a job? As Emma's nanny or tutor?" The words felt safer than acknowledging the other possibility that hung unspoken between them. James's smile was warm but complicated. "I mean, like, whatever we decide makes sense for our family," he said quietly, and Maya's breath caught on the word "our." The conversation continued late into the night. Two adults, trying to build something real and sustainable from the impossible foundation a 6-year-old had laid. They talked about Emma's needs, about Maya's career goals, about the practical realities of combining their very different lives. James offered her a position as Emma's private tutor and companion, with a salary that would allow her to rebuild her savings and eventually decide what came next. "No pressure," he assured her. "If it doesn't work out, you'll have enough saved to start over wherever you want." But Maya could see in his eyes that he hoped she wouldn't want to start over somewhere else. And if she was honest, the idea of leaving this warm house and the little girl who'd claimed her so completely felt impossible. By the time they finally said goodnight, they had the outline of a plan that just might work, and the beginning of something that felt suspiciously like a family. Maya woke up in the most comfortable bed she'd slept in for months, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over a garden that belonged in a magazine. For a moment she wondered if the entire previous day had been an elaborate dream. But then she heard Emma's voice in the hallway, clearly giving someone detailed instructions about breakfast preferences. "Maya likes her eggs scrambled but not too mushy, and she probably wants orange juice, because that's what kids always want at school. And make sure there are strawberries because they're the happiest fruit." Maya smiled into her pillow, amazed by this child who had somehow memorized her preferences from a single meal. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, followed by Emma's voice calling, "Maya, are you awake? We have so much to do today." The enthusiasm in that little voice made Maya's decision for her. Whatever happened next, she was going to fight to make this impossible situation work. 3 weeks later, Maya was beginning to believe that fairy tales might actually come true, though they were messier and more complicated than the storybook suggested. Emma had thrown herself into their new arrangement with the single-minded determination of a child who'd finally gotten exactly what she wanted. But the adjustment hadn't been seamless for anyone. There had been tears when Emma realized Maya couldn't magically replace her mother, tantrums when the new routine disrupted her carefully constructed world, and moments when Maya wondered if she was doing more harm than good. James had been endlessly patient, helping navigate the emotional landmines while trying to balance his own complicated feelings about having another woman in his home. Mrs. Henderson had become Maya's unofficial guide to the family dynamics, sharing insights about Emma's triggers and James's habits with the wisdom of someone who'd been watching over them, both since Emma was born. The house itself was slowly starting to feel less like a museum and more like a home, though Maya still caught herself being careful with the expensive furniture. The biggest surprise had been how naturally she and James had fallen into a partnership around Emma's care. He would handle the business calls while Maya helped with homework. She would manage bedtime stories while he dealt with household crises. And somehow they developed an unspoken communication system that let them tag team the challenges of raising a grieving 6-year-old. "You're good at this," James had told her one evening after they'd successfully navigated one of Emma's emotional meltdowns together. "Better than I've been managing on my own." The admission had been quiet, vulnerable, and Maya had seen something in his eyes that suggested he was talking about more than just parenting. She'd felt it too, the way they seemed to complement each other, the ease with which they'd adapted to sharing the responsibility for Emma's happiness. It was both thrilling and terrifying. This growing sense that she might actually belong in this life they were building together. Emma's progress at school had been remarkable, her teachers commenting on how much more focused and happy she seemed. "Whatever you're doing at home, keep it up," Mrs. Rodriguez had told Maya during their first parent-teacher conference, which had felt surreal in the best possible way. Emma had beamed with pride when Maya attended the school play, waving enthusiastically from the stage and announcing to anyone who would listen that Maya was in the audience. The possessive way Emma claimed her maid, Maya's heart swelled with a fierce protectiveness she hadn't expected. James had been there too, of course, But Maya had noticed how Emma made sure to include her in every important moment, as if afraid that Maya might disappear if she wasn't properly anchored to their family. The three of them were learning to be a unit, imperfect and unconventional but undeniably real. Maya had started thinking of it as their life rather than James's life that she was temporarily sharing. The hardest moments came when Emma would mention her mother, usually in casual ways that caught both adults off guard. Mommy used to read me this story, but I like the way Maya does the voices better, she'd announced one evening, then immediately looked stricken as if she'd betrayed someone. James had handled it perfectly, kneeling down to Emma's level and reminding her that loving Maya didn't mean forgetting Mommy, that hearts were big enough for multiple people. Maya had excused herself to the bathroom to cry quietly, overwhelmed by the complexity of stepping into a space left by someone else's tragedy. These moments were getting easier, but they still reminded everyone that this unconventional family had been born from loss as much as from hope. James had started sharing stories about his late wife, not as a way to exclude Maya, but to help Emma integrate her memories with their new reality. Maya had also begun to understand the full scope of James's wealth and what it meant for their future together. The casual mention of the house in the Hamptons or the jet had initially intimidated her, but she'd gradually realized that James was more concerned with whether she'd be overwhelmed by his lifestyle than impressed by it. "I don't want you to feel like you have to change who you are to fit into this world," he'd told her one night when she'd seemed particularly quiet after a charity event where she'd met his social circle. Emma fell in love with Maya the teacher, not Maya trying to be someone else. The reassurance had meant everything, especially since Maya had been struggling with imposter syndrome in a world where her outfit probably cost less than most people's appetizers. But James had a way of making her feel valued for exactly who she was, even when she felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The romantic tension between Maya and James had been building slowly, carefully, like two people afraid to disturb something precious. They'd graduated from polite conversation to genuine friendship, sharing late-night talks about everything from Emma's future to their own dreams and fears. Maya had learned that James was nothing like the cold businessman she'd initially imagined. He was thoughtful, funny, and desperately devoted to his daughter's happiness. He'd discovered that Maya was brilliant, resilient, and had a way of seeing solutions where others saw only problems. The attraction was undeniable, but both of them were acutely aware that Emma's emotional well-being had to come first. They moved around each other carefully, professionally, even as the air between them crackled with possibility. Maya caught James watching her sometimes with an expression that made her pulse quicken, and she knew he'd noticed the way she blushed when he smiled at her. Emma, with the intuitive wisdom that seemed to be her specialty, had started making increasingly obvious attempts to push them together. "Maya, doesn't Daddy look handsome in his blue shirt?" she'd announce at breakfast. "Daddy, Maya smells like flowers today, doesn't she?" The child's matchmaking efforts were both endearing and mortifying, especially when she'd accidentally leave them alone together or insist they sit next to each other during movie nights. James had started giving Maya looks that were half amused and half apologetic, but Maya could see that he wasn't entirely opposed to his daughter's interference. The night Emma had announced that she'd dreamed about Maya and Daddy getting married, like in the princess movies, had been the closest they'd come to addressing the elephant in the room directly. Both adults had stammered through explanations about how real life was different from fairy tales, but neither had been able to hide their flushed cheeks from Emma's knowing gaze. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening when Emma had fallen asleep during story time, curled between Maya and James on the big couch in the family room. They'd been reading Charlotte's Web, and Emma had drifted off during the sad parts, her small hand clutched in Maya's while her head rested against James's shoulder. "She feels safe," James had whispered, careful not to wake his daughter. "For the first time since her mother died, she feels completely secure." Maya had looked down at Emma's peaceful face, then up at James, and seen her own emotions reflected in his eyes. Love, hope, and the terrifying recognition that this had become so much more than a convenient arrangement. "James," she'd started to say, but he'd shaken his head gently. "I know," he'd whispered back. "I feel it too." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, even as Emma slept peacefully in the space they'd created together. The next morning brought unexpected challenges when James's mother, Eleanor Wellington, arrived unannounced for what she called a family inspection. Eleanor was everything Maya had feared James's family would be: elegant, intimidating, and clearly skeptical about the young woman, who'd somehow insinuated herself into her son's life. "So you're the teacher Emma has been talking about," she'd said, with the kind of smile that wasn't quite friendly. Maya had felt every inch of her humble background under Eleanor's appraising gaze. From her, target clothes to her lack of pedigree. Emma, however, had been thrilled to introduce her grandmother to Maya, "Who's going to be my new mommy," which had caused Eleanor's eyebrows to rise dangerously high. James had intervened quickly, but the damage was done. The family secret was officially out, and Eleanor Wellington was not impressed. Maya had excused herself to help Mrs. Henderson with lunch, needing space to process the reality that James's family might never accept her. The conversation between James and his mother had been loud, enough for Maya to overhear from the kitchen, and what she heard made her stomach clench with familiar shame. "She's completely inappropriate. James, what do you really know about her background, her family, her intentions?" Eleanor's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You can't seriously be considering a relationship with someone you picked up off the street." The words hit Maya like physical blows, reminding her of all the reasons this fairy tale couldn't last. She'd started mentally packing her few belongings, preparing to disappear before she could cause any more disruption to James's world. But then she'd heard James's response, his voice steel-hard with anger she'd never heard before. "That woman has brought more joy into Emma's life in 3 weeks than anyone has managed in the past year. If you can't see that, then maybe you need to reconsider whether you belong in Emma's life." The fierce protectiveness in his voice had made Maya's knees weak with gratitude and something much deeper. Emma had found Maya crying quietly in the guest room after lunch, and with the emotional intelligence that continued to amaze everyone, had climbed onto the bed and wrapped her small arms around Maya's shoulders. "Grandma Eleanor doesn't understand yet that you're perfect for us," Emma had said matter-of-factly. "But she will, because Daddy will explain it to her, and I'll show her all the ways you make me happy." The child's absolute faith in their family's ability to overcome obstacles had been both heartbreaking and inspiring. "What if she's right, though?" Maya had asked, voice thick with tears. "What if I don't belong in your world?" Emma had pulled back to look at her with serious, blue eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Maya, you don't belong in our world. You are our world now. There's a difference." The simple profundity of that statement had made Maya cry harder, but they were different tears, tears of recognition rather than despair. James had found them there an hour later, Emma patting Maya's back with the kind of maternal comfort that broke all their hearts a little. "My mother is gone," he'd announced simply, settling onto the bed beside them. "I've made it clear that anyone who can't respect the woman Emma and I both love isn't welcome in our home." The casual way he'd said love had made Maya's breath catch, and she'd seen Emma's face light up with triumph. "You told Grandma Eleanor that you love Maya?" Emma had demanded, practically vibrating with excitement. James had looked directly at Maya then, his brown eyes soft and vulnerable. "I told her the truth, that I'm in love with Maya, and that if she wants to be part of our family, she needs to accept all of us." The declaration had hung in the air like a promise, and Maya had felt the last of her defenses crumble completely. "I love you too," she'd whispered, and Emma had squealed with delight that could probably be heard 3 houses away. The proposal, when it came 2 months later, was perfectly Emma. James had been planning something elaborate and romantic, but Emma had taken matters into her own hands during a family dinner at their favorite restaurant. "Maya," she'd announced, standing on her chair to address the entire dining room, "Daddy has a very important question to ask you, And I think you should say yes because we're already the best family ever. Before either adult could stop her, she'd grabbed the ring box from James's jacket pocket, where she'd obviously been keeping track of it, and presented it to Maya with a flourish. "Will you marry my daddy and be my mommy forever and ever?" The entire restaurant had erupted in applause, and James had dropped to one knee right there between the tables, his face a mixture of mortification and pure joy. "Well," he'd said, grinning up at Maya while Emma bounced excitedly beside him, "I guess this is happening. Maya Chen, will you marry us?" Maya had said yes through tears and laughter, and Emma had immediately begun planning the wedding with the efficiency of a professional event coordinator. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day in the garden where Maya had first glimpsed their life together, she stood in a simple white dress that Emma had helped choose, watching James's face as she walked down an aisle scattered with rose petals. Emma served as both flower girl and ring bearer, taking her duties with the utmost seriousness, and only stopping to wave enthusiastically at their guests twice. Even Eleanor Wellington was there, having grudgingly admitted that Maya made both James and Emma happier than she'd seen them in years. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Emma interrupted with a stage whisper that carried across the entire gathering. "This is the part where they promise to love each other forever, just like I planned." The laughter that rippled through their guests was warm and full of love for this unconventional family that had been born from a little girl's determination to fix all the broken pieces. Maya caught James's eye and saw her own wonder reflected there. Somehow, impossibly, Emma's crazy plan had actually worked. As they danced to their first song as husband and wife, Emma wedged firmly between them because she'd insisted on being part of every important moment. Maya marveled at the path that had brought them here. A year ago, she'd been sleeping on cardboard, invisible and forgotten by a world that had no place for her. Now she was Mrs. James Wellington, mother to the most remarkable little girl on earth, partner to a man who loved her exactly as she was. "Thank you," she whispered to Emma, who was spinning between their arms with pure joy. "For what?" Emma asked, though her grin suggested she knew exactly what Maya meant. "For seeing what we could be before we knew it ourselves," Maya replied. Emma's response was vintage. Emma's wise beyond her years, but still completely 6 years old. "That's what families do, Maya. We see the best in each other and then we make it real." As the song ended and their guests applauded, Maya knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, the teacher, the businessman, and the little girl who had saved them all.